Welcome back to another edition of the Quantum Yoga Podcast. Today we have Dr. Dean Radin, and Dr. Radin is the Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, otherwise known as IONS, Associated Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, author of 4 books now, one that is being released this month of April called Real Magic, as well as Supernormal, Entangled Minds and the Conscious Universe, written and published over 250 technical and popular articles. It's an honor to have you on the program. I think a good place to start would be a backgrounder for listeners that are unfamiliar with ions, general concepts of psi, and that could be a platform to launch into your book.
Okay. Well, IONS was started in 1973 by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut who landed on the moon. He was the 6th person on the moon. Edgar, as you can imagine, being an astronaut and a Navy pilot and an MIT doctorate, was a pretty scientific and technical sort of guy. And yet on the way back to the Earth from the moon, he had a classic experience of samadhi. He didn't know that's what it was called at the time. He described it as a sense of unity with first the Earth, then all life on Earth, and then all life in space, and then the whole shebang, basically. So he was quite intrigued, as you can imagine, with that experience in space. And it was sparked by simply seeing the Earth sitting like a blue marble in the blackness of the void, and realizing that everyone he had ever known, anyone that we know in history, all life as we know it only existed on that one tiny little spot out there in space. So this is what sparked his contemplation and eventually an absorption into a samadhi condition. So being an engineer and a scientist, when he came back to Earth, he basically was asking, what in the world was that? And quickly discovered that there's a very large literature on this, and people have talked about it forever. But from a scientific perspective, very, very little is known about what's going on in these experiences. So our institute, the initial mission was said as exploring the frontiers of consciousness. And I was a graduate student at the time when the institute formed, and I thought this is the greatest thing ever, that at least that somebody somewhere was trying to use the tools of science to try to figure out what are these experiences that are as ancient as we know and yet still as vibrantly alive today as they've ever been. So it took years later, after I was working in industry for 10 years, and then I spent some time at Princeton University and then at University of Edinburgh and a few other places, where I slowly was able to change my career from one that was mainly focused on engineering psychology and human factors research to one where I was able to spend full time working on consciousness studies. And so within the domain of consciousness studies, there's some people looking at the neuroscience of it and lots of people doing various kinds of qualitative and phenomenological research. But I've always been attracted to the anomalous, to what doesn't quite fit. And the reason is that it's partially just historically that it's the anomalies that show where the next stage of our scientific evolution is going to go. It's the things that don't fit that are more important in the sense of where do you go next than the things that you already do know. It's risky to focus on the anomalies because sometimes they turn out to be nothing, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they turn out to be something big. So the anomalies I was interested in studying, because they are studyable, are several classes of psychic phenomena. So psychic phenomena like mystical experience have been around forever, all throughout history, every culture, every level of educational achievement. And yet, from a scientific perspective, what we can do with these phenomena is bring them into the laboratory and study them using all the same tools that you use to study anything else, and gain at least a sense of confidence that the phenomena that people report are actually true. So when you hear an anecdote about something that sounds like telepathy or precognition, you never know based on the anecdote what's going on. But when we bring those phenomena into the laboratory under controlled conditions, we can test if the effect is what we think it looks like, as opposed to the usual explanations like coincidence or misremembering or confabulation and so on. So we can rule out all of the mundane explanations, and if what you're left over with, it's as like with Sherlock Holmes, if you're left over and you've gotten rid of all the usual explanations, then there's something going on. Well, I've done this kind of work almost for 40 years now, and I'm convinced that there's something going on. So that becomes a major challenge, just as Edgar Mitchell's experience was a major challenge for him, that we still don't exactly understand what mystical experience is. There are lots of theories of it, and it's very difficult to study mystical experience in the lab, but we can study its close cousin, which is psychic phenomena. And so there we're beginning to make headway, I think, in terms of how it works, what modulates the abilities, who has it and who doesn't. Maybe there's some pragmatic consequences, and also beginnings of theoretical models for how do we begin to understand it without having to throw away all the rest of science.
So psi is a term to describe this category of research. Is that appropriate to use that word, or is that one aspect of it?
Now, psi is a euphemism or an umbrella term. It's spelled usually PSI, and it's the first letter of the Greek word psyche in Greek. P is psi. So it's not all capitalized. It's just the word psi. And it's part of a long history in studying these kinds of phenomena, because it used to be called psychical research, and then psychic research, and then parapsychology, and then the term psi was used, and we also have terms like anomalous cognition and other terms like this. The reason why the terms change is because parapsychology in the public's mind is associated with psychics that you'd see in the mall or in the movies, or magic as portrayed in the movies. And it's very difficult then to say that, well, what somebody asks, what do you do? And I say, I'm a parapsychologist. I then have to spend the next 10 minutes making them understand that that's not what they thought I am, because of so you come up with new terms every so often, so you don't have to keep explaining to people what it is that you do.
Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. Well, the focus of our conversation is on your new publication, Real Magic, and this being your fourth book. Is there a thread that's a meme that's kind of continuing here from your previous book, or is this an entirely new exploration for you?
Well, I originally planned on a trilogy, but it turned out to be longer than that, so it's a quartet, or whatever the term is for four. And I'm already thinking of 5 and 6, so it's going to end up being bigger than a trilogy. So the first book was The Conscious Universe, and this was addressing the issue of how do we know that things like telepathy are real from a scientific perspective. Well, that requires a couple of hours worth of lecture or a book. And I got tired of doing lectures, so I decided to just put it into a book. And the upshot of it is that in science, the gold standard is independent replication of experiments. Parapsychology, among the different disciplines, probably has done the most replications of any discipline, primarily because both the people doing the research, like myself and my colleagues around the world, and people who are interested but not involved in it, if you do one experiment and you get an interesting result, that's just not enough. You need replications. And even when we do replications, I can do an experiment, get a good result. I'm not sure I believe it. So I have to do it again and again and again and again. So there have been lots and lots of replications, many of them using more or less exactly the same method, as close as you can imagine. So it's really replication as opposed to conceptual replication. So conceptual replication happens too. That's where you start tweaking things and seeing what factors matter and what factors don't. But within parapsychology, there is a huge number of close to exact replications by independent laboratories. Then, once you have that, you have to assess whether or not the replication is actually real. So that brings us to meta-analysis. So that book was basically pulling together all of the repeated experiments in parapsychology and then using meta-analysis and explaining how to interpret it and what the results were, all of that. That's like stage one, to get past the notion of is this real or not. So that took a whole book. The second book was Entangled Minds, and it's because people often will say, well, this stuff is impossible because it violates the laws of physics. And so Entangled Minds is about the laws of physics, not from the 17th century, but from today. And when you go through that in some detail, you find out that these phenomena don't violate anything we know from today's physics. It would have in Newton's time, but not today. So that takes another book to flesh out why that is so. And I took the opportunity to also bring the database up to date and did new meta-analyses. The third book was, again, addressing this notion of people today, still many of whom will say this is impossible. Like precognition is logically incoherent, so it can't exist. Or telepathy, you can't have brain waves that are going across the world and having somebody else pick it up. It's impossible. So underneath all of that is the question of, well, then how can we understand how this works? If you claim that it's real, how do we know that it's real? And people always want an explanation for everything. Even though, as I keep trying to point out again and again, there are lots of things that we use all the time that we don't understand. So the classic is aspirin, which was used for probably over 100 years, well before we understood the underlying mechanisms. And the same is true for many other things, that just for pragmatic purposes, we can use things without understanding them in any detail. So the third book, I decided to start looking at clues from esoteric traditions that would maybe give us a heads up on how to begin to look at our assumptions within the scientific worldview today that cause us to really think hard on how come we don't understand this. Again, it goes back to my interest in anomalies. So the first tradition that I decided to look at in detail was the yogic tradition, primarily because the Yoga Sutras, written by Patanjali around 2,000 years ago, has an entire chapter devoted to the siddhis, to these special powers that yogis develop after a while. And I then mapped what you can tell from the Yoga Sutra siddhis into what parapsychology has studied to see, are these the same? Are they different? How do we think about them? And the bottom line then of that book is that of at least of the elementary siddhis, the 25 or so that Patanjali talks about, the elementary ones are what we would call in the laboratory precognition, which is the very first siddhi he talks about, telepathy, and minor forms of mind-matter interaction. Most of the siddhis are basically clairvoyance, various forms of clairvoyance. So we can tell, because we've been able to test these things in a laboratory, that Patanjali wasn't making up fairy tales. It suggests that the other really big siddhis that he's talking about, unlike what you see in some modern books on yoga, they will interpret the siddhis as metaphors or as allegories. They'll come up with stories to say why it's not really telepathy, it's something else. Well, no. What he was talking about is what we would today call telepathy and precognition and clairvoyance and psychokinesis and many other things. So the challenge with the siddhis is that we generally we're not able to find yogis who are adept enough, who can do things like levitation or invisibility, to come into the lab and demonstrate it. So we can't say anything about those kinds of phenomena from a scientific perspective. There are anecdotes, but anecdotes don't have much currency in science. So, but Patanjali wasn't making it up. Let's put it that way. So the book that's about to come out now, called Real Magic, is an expansion of looking at the esoteric traditions. So yoga is a good way of it's a representation or a representative of Eastern esoteric practice. So I decided to look at the Western esoteric practice. And so now we're talking about from pre-Pythagoras through Plato, and then this whole lineage of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, Gnosticism, the Kabbalah, and then in the Middle Ages, starting with Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, Theosophy, and the more modern era with New Thought, religious science, mind science, Christian science, and a huge genre having to do with affirmations. They are all out of the same tradition. The esoteric traditions on the practical side were alchemy and astrology and herbalism. So those three elements of the practical side of esotericism became science because they were no longer involved with the supernatural. Alchemy is completely about natural magic, and the same is true for astrology and herbalism, but they all got turned into chemistry, astronomy, and the pharmaceutical business. That's when we stripped out the esoteric elements of it and put it into what we think of as modern science. But those three practical elements had a fourth. There was a fourth cousin that has been dropped out of science. And the fourth cousin is magic. And so whereas alchemy was focused on material substances and astrology and the heavens and herbalism about healing, the fourth element in it was had to do with the nature of the mind. And so the nature of consciousness and mind is that fourth natural magic, which is actually what we would today call magic, real magic. So this book is then looking at the relationship between, again, what we know from scientific studies we can do in the laboratory as compared to what was thought to be the way that magic worked, mental magic primarily. And as it turns out, just like it is with the Yoga Sutras, that the forms of magic from the esoteric traditions are exactly what we've been testing in the laboratory for 100 years. So there's a one-to-one match. And I think not very many people know that. And I didn't know it in the degree of depth that I now do. So I decided a book about that. So that's what it is.
Yeah. What was the point where, maybe when this was going on pre-science, people thought about these practices as magic to the point of that word sort of coming out of fashion and now calling it science? What was that fundamental shift that occurred? Were there presuppositions behind it? Was this more about stripping away spirituality from science? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's all of the above. So the reason why the esoteric traditions are called esoteric is because they are hidden or they're taboo, they're suppressed. And they've been suppressed by whoever was the authorities at the time. So for a long, long time, 1,000 years, it was the Catholic Church or the Roman Catholic Church. These phenomena were well accepted within the church, but practiced outside of the church, they were heretical. So this is basically a power struggle. So pagan magic, today neo-paganism is alive and well, as is Wicca and other forms of what amounts to ancient practices that are somewhere between shamanism and slightly more modern versions of those practices. The Catholic ceremony or ritual of the Eucharist is explicitly a magical practice. It's one where bread and wine are not simply bread and wine, but they're the body and the blood of Christ. That's the whole point of the ceremony. Whether you believe that that's what's actually happening or not doesn't matter from a secular perspective, but from within the faith, that is literally magic. And it's okay because the priests are ordained to do that kind of magic. If you're not a priest who's ordained to do that, you are doing it as a heretic, and therefore it gets suppressed. So there's a huge range of practices that were essentially ritual magic that were declared, don't do that. And that's where it becomes esoteric. And this is also why the term occult has taken on a negative connotation. It's only because of the suppression. All that occult means is hidden. And it became hidden because people said, don't do that or we will kill you. So that's the origin of that. Now I forgot where your question was.
Essentially, that was it, yeah. Well, can we talk more about this fourth element called magic and this one-to-one relationship that you're pairing with the psi research?
Right. So you do a synthesis of all of the traditions running back from shamanism to now. It's roughly 50,000 years worth of things that people have done. And scholars tend to focus on the differences and the nuances between the different traditions, different cultures, and so on. There's a huge scholarly body of work on this. And I decided to take the opposite approach, which was to look at the similarities. It's partially because you could spend your life becoming a scholar on the differences, and I don't want to do that. I want to find clues that can tell us what are we missing from a scientific perspective that might tell us how these things work, because we know that they work from the lab. So the three elements of magic, when you do a synthesis, are divination. So in today's terms, we'd call it clairvoyance. It all had to do with being able to perceive through time and space. So through space, we use words like clairvoyance, and through time, precognition, but they're basically the same thing. It's perceiving beyond space and time. So the methods of divination are well known today. They're everything from throwing the runes to the I Ching, to mirror gazing and crystal ball gazing, that whole realm. The second class I call force of will, which in modern terms we'd call psychokinesis, or mind-matter interaction effects. This is how magic is usually portrayed in fiction. It's the lightning bolt shooting out of your fingertips, and people flying, and large-scale physical things happening, where you manifest what you wish. And the third category is theurgy, which means God work, and it's referencing the idea of getting the gods to work for you, or the spirits to work for you. So this is the occult connotation of ceremonial magic, is that people are around a pentagram or something, and they're evoking spirits, usually demonic-looking, horrible things, and then you ask them to do things on your behalf. That's what that's all about. So in parapsychology, that involved with things like mediumship studies, studying a person who claims to talk to dead people or spirits, trying to understand what's going on there. Also the study of near-death experiences and other phenomena having to do with either survival of consciousness or consciousness that's embodied in other forms. So the three categories of classical magic, I don't know if there's a modern form of magic, but I'll just say classical magic because I don't know what else to use. And an occultist would put a K at the end of magic. I tend not to do that because it just becomes confusing. It also has a connotation of the occult, and even though that's what it is, and people don't think of occult as hidden, I'm trying to avoid the negative connotation. So we've studied the three classes of traditional magic in the laboratory, and up until about a year before I started working on this book, if somebody had said, you're going to write a book about classical magic, I would have said, you're crazy. Because this has nothing to do with magic. I mean, magic is like fiction. It's Harry Potter and Harry Houdini. And now I was surprised, actually. And first of all, how much scholarship that has been done on magic, magical beliefs and magical practices. There's a huge database there. And the second, that I've been essentially studying the nature of magic for almost 40 years without realizing it. And to which, among other things, shows the degree of suppression that has gone on. In the academic world, you can talk about magic from an anthropological perspective and from a historical perspective, but you cannot talk about it as possibly real. So there's a very small sliver of people in anthropology, especially ones who do field work, who come away saying, holy crap, I saw something, and then they don't talk about it. They talk about it to themselves or to their close colleagues. But you can't say in the academy that we think these things are real. And by the same token, you can't do parapsychology very easily either. So those are the classes of magic. The real reason for doing all of this was, again, to go back to the question of how do we begin to think about it in a way that doesn't require that we do violence to what we already know about the way the world works. And this comes up again and again, because when I talk to scientists who I know who may even be sympathetic or even have had their own experiences about this stuff, they avoid it because it's uncomfortable, because we don't know what to do with it. And I simply decided that I wasn't willing to let it go, I guess. That I, like everyone else, wants to get some kind of an idea of how to think about this without throwing away the textbooks, because that's the fear I hear oftentimes. So I think I did. As a result of going through a large chunk of the esoteric literature, you can synthesize not only the practices, but also the underlying beliefs. Like what did people believe in the Middle Ages about this, or what did Plato believe, and so on. So there too, you can look at the differences or you can look at the similarities in these beliefs. So in terms of the similarities, it all comes down to a very simple concept, namely that consciousness is fundamental. And this is said in many different ways in different cultures, but that's the essence of it, that the consciousness is fundamental. There is only one consciousness, and it's more fundamental than what we think of as the physical world. This, by the way, is also part of yoga theory, like Sankhya theory. It's the same thing. You see it again and again repeated. This is not part of current science. And this is the reason why magic, psychic phenomena, mysticism are so difficult to understand from a scientific lens. But as I flesh out in the book, I think there's a way to make science compatible with it without throwing away the textbooks.
Yeah, I'd love to get into that a little more detail later. One last point about your historical survey of all of these practices, that it was just a good read, leading all the way up to where it may actually connect with people. And you talked about Tony Robbins, and you talked about the law of attraction, and you talked about so many things that people who are, we'll say, maybe just kind of disheartened with this isolated view, this worldview, where consciousness is not fundamental, are practicing these things, or seeking out these things. And you're saying that this is one aspect of modern magic.
Absolutely. It is magic. That's the thing. We tend not to see in popular culture the degree to which magic has never gone away. Right? When something is real, it doesn't fade away like a fantasy. It remains. It may not be allowed to remain in a way that it did in the past, because culture determines how we talk about things. So if you have ideas that have been suppressed for a couple thousand years, and by the way, it used to be suppressed by the church, and then it was suppressed by science, and is still suppressed by science. So you have both the church and science, which are two large power structures in modern society that are both saying, "Oh, magic is superstition and doesn't work anymore." At exactly the same time, you have just as many people doing superstitious behavior as they ever did. You have billions of people who pray. You have billions of people who are now, I don't know about billions, but millions of people who are meditating, using affirmations. This is all part of the magical tradition. And all of it has to do with the notion that there's something that you can do internally through your experience that will cause some kind of a change out there in the world. So the number of people who think all of that is complete nonsense is very, very small in terms of percentages. You have probably those who call themselves militant atheists, who are just violently angry about all this stuff, who will deny that any of it makes any sense. But I'm guessing that's 10% or less of the population. It's a small minority. They just happen to be loud. So I'm not a religious person. I'm not an atheist, or I'm probably dead center agnostic. I don't know about religion very well. But I'm also not willing to deny what 90% of people are doing, because a lot of those people are not country bumpkins. they're academics and people just as smart as anybody else. So what do they know that somebody else doesn't know? So the way, if you have a society that is suppressing something that people want and are practicing, the only way that it's easily able to come out is through the media. And I'm talking specifically entertainment media. And if you look at fictional books, you look at TV and movies, the theme that has probably brought in the most dollars is themes having to do with these topics, special powers of people, special abilities, that sort of thing. It's now, I did a short analysis in the book on what are the most popular forms of entertainment, and all of them revolve around magic in its various forms. This tells me that just if you have some kind of truth and you try to suppress it, it can't go away, so it pops up in different forms. So it's popping in entertainment. That provides a clue, just like mythology provides a clue, that if you have ideas that are not socially acceptable to talk about and that become taboo, all it does is make the taboo stronger. And so it'll appear in some other form. So it's true that the whole genre about affirmations, and for that matter, mind-body medicine, which started in the same way, and positive psychology, once you start digging into it and looking at where do those ideas come from, it all devolves directly back, all the way back to Plato and before. That's where it's from. So it then behooves us as a scientist, I'm interested in saying, well, if there's some truth in that, what is it? Well, the research that we do, mostly laboratory research, is saying, well, as best as we can tell using the best tools of science that we know, some of that stuff is real. So some of these phenomena are real.
Can we go there? Can we start talking about the science that you have done and the science that you have compiled to support this? I'm sure people now are like, yeah, tell us what you know.
Yeah, so in my 3 previous books, I go into this topic in some great gory detail to describe classes of experiments, the results of the experiments, results of repetitions of the experiments, the criticisms of the experiments, on and on and on. It requires book-length treatments to do it justice. There's 3 reactions to what I've heard from feedback when people start looking into this. One reaction is too many words or too many numbers. So there's some people that they just don't think in numbers and words, so they don't like it because it took too much brain power or something to pay attention. So they're looking for stories, and of course we all like stories better. But I'm interested in the data. What does the actual data say? To me, that's a story as well because I've learned that story. So that it's not going to appeal to those kinds of people. The second type are people who say that I spend far too much time in these books bashing the critics, which I find very interesting because actually I spend a very small amount of time in my books addressing standard criticisms. And the only reason I do that is to point out that the criticisms are wrong. It's easy to show that they're wrong. And yet I can easily tell when somebody writes a review or something of a book that they're coming from not a true skeptical position, because that would simply be doubt, but they're coming from a position where in their head they're thinking this is impossible. And so all they can see from what I've written is you're just angry at skeptics, and that's not the issue. The third type of person will look at it and basically freak out in a good way because they have some kind of technical training or scientific training, and they did not realize that there actually is a lot of data available. So I'll just give one example of what I'm talking about here in terms of data. So if you want to test whether telepathy is real, you can split experiments into conscious performance, because we know about these phenomena because people talk about them. So it reaches the level of awareness to some extent. So you can do experiments that way, or in more modern times, you do a lot of experiments using physiological measures, where you don't ask anybody to do anything. You simply look at how the body is responding, because that gives you a reflection of what's happening at a deeper level of awareness, where it's actually below their conscious awareness. It's in their subconscious. those give much stronger results because it bypasses all kinds of psychological filters. But if you wanted to study conscious telepathy, a method has developed over 40 years now, maybe 50 years, called the Ganzfeld technique. Ganzfeld is a German word meaning whole field. It was developed by Gestalt therapists and German Gestalt therapists in the 1930s, or psychologists who are studying, among other things, what happens if you put people into conditions of sensory deprivation or unpatterned sensory stimulation. So we think of something like a flotation tank as a sensory deprivation environment. This is not quite like that. This is shining a red light over your eyes where you have a translucent hemisphere over each eye, otherwise called a ping pong ball. And you have the subject keep their eyes open, and with a red light shining everywhere they look, you only see a uniform pink color. But when you're sitting with your eyes open, or even lying down with your eyes open, it's very difficult to go to sleep. So this is stimulating you. It's keeping you awake, but there's no visual stimulus. Then you put on headphones playing white noise, so there's no auditory stimulus. And sometimes you put big gloves on people, on their hands, and they sit in a comfy chair. And so you can't feel anything, you can't see anything. You're awake, though. Most people, after 10 minutes in this kind of environment, will begin to hallucinate, or they'll go into a hypnagogic state. And this is what you want to happen. You want them to go into a dreamy state where they become exquisitely sensitive to any source of information. Now, a lot of that information is going to be generated by their own brain, dream, fantasies and stuff, but maybe you become more sensitive to things out in the rest of the world as well. So you put somebody in that state, you leave them there for 30 minutes. During that 30 minutes, you have somebody else trying to mentally send them information. And so what you do for the sender is that you have previously created pools of 4 pictures, typically, the pictures being as different from each other as possible. And then so you randomly select one of the pools, and then you randomly select one of the 4 in a pool, give that to the sender, and the sender's job is get this information about this picture into the other person's head. So they spend 20 minutes doing that. They can do it any kind of strategy that they want to try to get that information into their friend's head. Then after that period is stopped, you take the receiver out of this Ganzfeld condition back to a normal state. You show them 4 pictures, one of which was the real one, and 3 decoys. And of course, the person showing them the various pictures has no idea which is the right one. And the sender is secured somewhere else. So there's no leakage paths that could give them the right answer. So by chance, when you ask the receiver in this study to choose the one picture that seems to match their impressions the best, they'll choose it correctly 1 in 4 times. That's the best that they can do because they have no clues otherwise. So if telepathy isn't real, they'll get 25%. So after about 4,500 or so sessions of this type, conducted by 20 laboratories over 4 decades, mostly with college sophomores, selected without any claims of telepathy or anything else, just because they're there, you get 32%. So the statistically, when you look at what's the odds against chance of getting 32% if 25% was actually chance, the odds are billions and millions of billions to 1. So even though it doesn't sound like much, 32% versus 25%, statistically speaking, it is impossible for that to be a chance effect. So then you have to go back and say, well, maybe they had a confederate involved in the process and gave them a clue. Maybe it was fraud. Maybe it was a magic trick. Maybe. There's a list of roughly 20 different due diligence things that you go through in developing the protocol and the analysis and all the rest of it to make sure that it's not one of those kinds of mundane explanations. And since this experiment has been conducted for such a long period, lots of skeptics have said, well, I think it's this. There was like a little smudge because you held the actual picture and it created a smudge on it, and people see the smudge, and that's what it was, and on and on and on, down to extremely fine levels of minutia, which might be a clue. So the next experiment would get rid of that clue, or at least potential clue. And over the years, methods were developed so that if you follow the recipe that we knew was a good experiment, it was as close to loophole-free as we could possibly make it. And you still get 32%. If you select people who claim that they have had telepathic experiences, you get more like 50 to 75%. If you use people who are emotionally bonded from the same family, again, they get much higher percentages. If you use rank strangers who had not met each other before the experiment, you still don't get 25%. You get above that, but it's not anywhere near what you get when you select people. So that's one example of 5 or 6 classes of experiments that have been repeated again and again by different labs. And when you look at the overall results, what you can say then is, using the best methods that we know how, and these are gold standard methods used in lots of other disciplines, that if these were not considered controversial experiences, then these would have been accepted by anybody who's involved in science. Something similar to what I just said was said by the president of the American Statistical Association a couple of years ago, when she was president of the American Statistical Association. And she had spent a fair amount of time evaluating these kinds of studies for the US government. And so one of the reasons in this book on magic, where I don't spend that much time talking about how do we know this is real, partially because you can go to the other books and just read those. But also now I can say, look, if you ask the people who are specialists in understanding and evaluating data, these are statisticians, and if the president of the American Statistical Association is basically saying, without qualification, this is real stuff, that's the end of the argument. It's as real as we know how to make it be real in science. So the remaining questions are then more interesting, like what modulates these abilities? How does it work? And those kinds of things.
I remember listening to an interview you were speaking before about how meditators tend to do better in some of these experiences. And if I had to guess, this experience of sending information from one person while they're in a hypnagogic state, it almost sounds like the ability to kind of quiet the chatter has something to do with your ability to receive inputs.
That is exactly right. There's 2 elements. On the receiving side element, it's what you said, that you need a clear mind to be able to receive. Otherwise, mind wandering will make you start thinking about cheeseburgers. So that's part of it. The other part in receiving phenomena is that you need to decouple naming something from the raw experience. So meditators, well, at least experienced meditators, can get to a point where they can get the raw sensory input without immediately naming it. And so the part of the training that people go through to become better at clairvoyance is to unlearn the whole naming process. And of course, as adults, you have many, many years learning to instantly name something. So to give an example, if you're doing a remote viewing and you didn't know that I had a color somewhere in like an envelope, tell me what the color is. Or not just the color, but an object that has a color in it. So you might do you might get an impression of something that's yellow, just like a flash of something yellow. Most people will immediately say, oh, I know what that is. It's a banana. And so the moment you make that association, it's extremely difficult to unmake it. And in fact, maybe it wasn't a banana at all. It was an umbrella, or who knows what it was. It's something else. And so the thing that usually draws people into the wrong direction is making the association too fast.
Wow. That is really reshaping how I think about this all, because what I hear you saying is that we're all picking up these inputs. We're just negating their meaning, perhaps, by labeling something else.
Yeah, it's not negating it. It's doing what the brain knows how to do, right? The brain's an association machine, essentially. And evolution has shaped us to do those associations extremely fast, with completely unconsciously. Because if you see something that looks like orange and black stripes out of the corner of your eye, you had better start running before you realize that you made the association with a tiger, because otherwise you'd be dead. So we're doing this constantly. This is why stereotypes come about very quickly also, and why they're so difficult to get over. And so this is part of the receiving element. On the other side, where you're attempting to impress intentions out into the world to push things around, the problem there is that without attention training, you can't hold the intention long enough to be able to actually do anything. So we've tested people in the lab doing various kinds of psychokinetic tasks and taking their EEG while they're doing it to see how long somebody could actually keep a one-pointed focus on the target. Even with meditators, it's around 5 seconds. You've seen mind wandering almost immediately, even in trained people. Now, the trained people can go back, right? So in meditation, you're constantly, you wander, but you remember then to go back. If you don't have that training, people never come back. So that's the difference. That's why we tend to go with meditators, either for reception type experiments or intentional experiments, because they are able to go quiet and attend, and that's what these experiments are all about. And also, that's what these phenomena are about, too. It requires clear mind and strong intention.
There are different, so if we talk neuroscience here, sort of EEG patterns that occur with these two modes, right? In one case, when you're intending, this is a slightly more active state than when you are in a quiet mind state, when you're sort of receiving, and the ability to, like people who can do both things well are modulating these states. They're kind of like modulating with some kind of feel between these states. Would you agree?
Yeah, except that the intention, especially within meditation, I think the intention is different than it might be when you're playing a video game, right? They both involve very strong point of focus, but the video game type of focus is not the one that makes this stuff work. I'm talking about magic stuff, psychic stuff. So to make the magic work requires effortless striving, right? You need this clear one-pointedness and at the same time absolute, complete motivational intention. By the way, and that is exactly how Patanjali describes the siddhis. First, his step one, go into samadhi. Learn how to go there and stay there for as long as you wish. Okay, so that's a step most people will never get. But if once you pass that step, then the next step is after you're able to sustain this degree of one-pointedness and clear mind, then you put just a smidgen of an intentional spin, like you put your attention on something. Well, that's where the magic starts to happen. You look in the magical traditions, it is exactly the same. They will call it gnosis. You go into this state of gnosis, which is like samadhi, and you put an intentional spin with a bit of motivation of the type that you don't see in the usual everyday world. This is a motivation where it is completely one-pointed. Your intention and motivation are, this is the most important thing in the world ever, right now, right here. And oh, by the way, no anxiety. So this is the effortless striving, both at the same time, which are paradoxical, but that is the state.
Let's continue with this intention. One of the things that you write about in the book, or the heading of a chapter is, well, can I actually create my own reality? And I would love for you to unpack this, because this is huge. I mean, there's a whole world of law of attraction, affirmations, and the intention to create reality. And then, there's the polar opposite. Now we're just kind of reacting to what's occurring around us.
Right. Well, we all have wishes and desires, and we would like to think we could ask the genie for 3 wishes or have a magic wand. So it's not surprising that people are interested in it. So, and asking that question, how come I can't create my own reality? That's the opening line, I think, in that chapter. And my answer was, well, you can, sort of. And the sort of course, is the big qualifier. And there's a number of reasons why you can sort of create your own reality. So from a psychological perspective, your attitude determines a lot in terms of how you perceive the world. You can have exactly the same conditions that two people are in. One's going to be happy all the time. One's going to be depressed all the time because of their attitude. So that's just psychological. If you're thinking more about somebody who wants to create lucky circumstances or positive synchronicities and so on, that now we're beginning to intrude into a slightly different domain. Some of that is, again, psychological filtering. You can prime somebody to experience synchronicities almost all the time, just psychologically. Just priming them to be aware of certain things, and then they'll start noticing that, holy smoke, it's like their whole life is a synchronicity. Well, it's a psychological filter. So what part of this thing then is that if you imagine that you have like 40 or 50 layers of some kind of a slightly transparent vellum in front of you, those are the filters we're talking about. They distort what's actually out there. So my meditation practice is Vipassana, which is, it's all about trying to see clearly. It's getting all of these filters either out of the way or clear enough so you can see how things are, as opposed to how you'd like them to be. And of course, it's not easy. You're always getting some kind of distortion. But when you go further now into magic, and you're saying, well, no, I really want to start manipulating how things work. Well, I think you can do that. We see in the laboratory, using generally microscopic random systems or other kinds of very, very sensitive systems, that when you focus your intention on a physical system, it will change as a result. It doesn't always work. It seems to be a probabilistic kind of change, but nevertheless, it does something. Well, it's okay. So you can change the physical reality around you. When you start dealing with larger things, like I would like a suitcase with $1 million in cash to show up on my doorstep now. I want it right now. In principle, that's possible. That's somehow, somewhere, the suitcase is out there and things could happen and make it show up. It's probably not going to show up like in a cloud, like a poof, because that would take a lot of energy, and it's not clear that we have that ability. But to deflect something which is traveling from here to there in such a way that it shows up, it may be possible. On the other hand, you may have 7 or 8 billion other people who have intentions that are saying, "Oh no, you don't. Like you can't have that." So your intentions are not the only thing in the universe. I think it's not only other people, but all forms of sentience have intentions as well. And they're all pushing everything around all the time. So we're able to see things in the laboratory because we're working with very carefully calibrated and tuned systems and sensitive systems that no one else at the time is trying to do anything with it. And only a very small number of people actually even care whether the thing works or not. Most people don't pay much of attention to these kinds of studies. So I think that's how we're able to see the effects in the lab. A person doing something, you get a result, but it's not on nightly TV. And so, some people will eventually read the studies, but it's not enough of an impact on the world for other people's intentions to get in and muddy the waters. Whereas if I'm able to make suitcases of $1 million show up, that's going to make a lot of people unhappy or jealous or want the same thing or stop it. And each one's intention can be just as strong as the one I originally had. And that squishes it right from the get-go. So large-scale manifestation kinds of phenomena are very, very rare. They do happen, but they're extremely rare. So that's why you can create your own reality, most easily through psychological means, partially through divination means as well, that you can create synchronicities by being in the right place at the right time. Well, that can require just a perceptual effect to know to go down that street versus this other street, or to leave for an appointment now versus then. Those kinds of perceptual abilities to look at things happening in time and space, you can kind of arrange yourself to be at the right place at the right time. That's also how you can I think, create luck. You can be lucky by putting yourself in the right place, or you can be unlucky by doing the exact opposite. And then so the third element, the reason why you can't create your reality so well, is because all of us have built-in self-defeating mechanisms. And the easiest way to see that is how many people are smoking too much and eating too much and drinking too much. And the answer is the majority of the population. And these are people who know that what they're doing is not good, but we're not completely in charge. The conscious part of us is not completely in charge. And so self-defeating behavior, well, you might think that you want to have this thing happen, but a part of you is saying, no, I don't think so. And so it won't happen.
Your concluding thoughts in the book are just excellent, and I wonder if you could bring some of those into the conversation now as we round the bend here of the conversation.
I'm going to have to look at it, because the thing about writing a book, especially with a big publisher, is I turned this in to the publisher in almost final form 1 year ago. And so I have to remind myself. Somebody will say, on page 214, you said this. And I'm thinking, I did? Oh, that sounds pretty interesting. I wonder what I was talking about. So,
well, it harkens back to your comment that consciousness is fundamental. And there were a few other conclusions that you can make from all of the research and looking at the history of magic as well.
Right. So one of them is about psychic robots. So if we accept the hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental, meaning more fundamental than space and time, and that what we know about physics today is being emerging out of consciousness. Consciousness may be thought of as some other kind of, quote, substance or something like that. It's just part of the fabric of reality. And what we think of as particles and forces and fields and energy emerges out of that. This is a way for us to not throw away the textbooks, because once it emerges into physics, all the physics we know are perfectly fine, and so on. It emerges into chemistry and biology and so on. So all of the standard academic disciplines that we know now would remain the same, with a new underlying assumption that it's all coming out of something which is primordially aware. And also it's before space and time. So it's fundamental to being, it crosses space-time, which is why you're able to do psychic and mystical experiences, because those are, the only strange thing about those kinds of experiences is that they somehow transcend space and time. So we make that hypothesis. So one of the consequences of all this is that it means that the standard neuroscience approach today, which says that the mind and the brain are identical, and the consciousness is being generated by the brain, that is no longer true in this view, that consciousness came first. So it's not that the brain creates consciousness, it's that consciousness creates the brain. It's literally emerging out of this consciousness. That means that you may not need a brain in order to have awareness, which suddenly makes the magical notion of spirits way more plausible, because now you can have aware, intelligent entities that are not embodied in the way that we are. I mean, the whole point about spirits, the idea of it, and elves and fairies and all of the mythology associated with it, is that there are many, many forms in which awareness can take place, and some of those forms will be intelligent. The intelligence might have something to do with the brain. Maybe you need a complex object that has recursion and multiple circuits and, who knows, something to allow intelligence to arise out of awareness. In which case, I would make a prediction then that when the robots are sufficiently sophisticated so that their brains are enough like ours in terms of the complexity, we might find that they are aware in the same way that we are. They are conscious because the consciousness was there first, but the particular form of the way that their consciousness would come about is not through a human brain, but through some kind of a machine brain. So it could well be aware. If that is the case, and I'm predicting that when the singularity occurs, which is when the robots wake up, that they will be super psychic as well, and probably to be able to do magic almost in the way that we see in the movies. And the reason is that they don't have the psychological filters and the hundreds of millions of years of evolution that have shaped us away from those phenomena. So we'll end up with not only robots that will be our overlords, but they'll be psychic levitating wizard robots that are our overlords. And hopefully they will still think kindly of us.
Well, let the listeners know where they can get your book, Real Magic, how they can get more info about you and connect up online.
Well, one place to go is my website, deanradin.com or deanradin.org. Both will lead you to realmagicbook.com. And so I have links to all of the online booksellers. The book is in paperback and ebook form and also audiobook. And so I'm very happy that the audiobook is read by the voice artist who has read most of the Dan Brown books. So he's a professional, and I was given the opportunity to choose among 4 potential readers. And since as soon as I heard his voice, I remember, oh, I know that voice. I didn't know why, but then I looked it up, and he did Angels and Demons and some of the other Dan Brown books, and he has a really great reading voice. So he's done the audiobook as well. So it's available anywhere where books are sold.